do you think? Sorry, do you think that Xi Jinping's sort of rule in China has made like a real marked difference, or is it just like that we see it now more openly?
I mean, I think that that has been the other big shift, and the way it's, I think the way some of the China analysts describe it, it is this move from soft authoritarianism to totalitarianism,
Mm.
and I mean the kind of that's been what it that's been the tangible difference that there's been, and one can debate, and I mean certainly in the book, and for lots of people, it's not just a Xi Jinping question. That's certainly not the case. And you can make an argument that says that this is as much about China's power position as anything else. He's able to do this because China is now strong enough to do this.
Mm.
And in other circumstances, another leader, even Deng Xiaoping, arguably at an appropriate juncture, would have turned around and said, now is the point in which we can kind of step up and throw our weight around differently. We don't have to we don't have to placate the Americans. We can advance a very different agenda now. And certainly that was already unfolding. A lot of the developments that we are now complaining about in a very different way, the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy stuff and economic coercion. I mean, lots of this stuff was already in evidence before Xi Jinping took over. So it's not unique to him, but it's certainly the case that there are a series of trends in China that have felt like they're going in reverse. The recent party congress, and I mean, whether that's politically, the level of domestic repression, the reach of the party, but on the economic side too, that always been this kind of dangled hope for a long time of just the economic reform piece on this, that China was still marketizing in a certain way. And that was one of the other reasons that all of this took so long. There were real biting reforms that they had to make to join the WTO. And for a long time afterwards, there was still a process that was underway there. And there were still figures who looked like they were kind of part of that process and did genuinely want to make some of these changes. Under Xi Jinping, it is politics first, security first, fused into this kind of ideological cocktail as well that's increasingly come to the fore.
Yeah.
And the economy does not matter as much. So it means that China's economic power is also far more instrumentalized to serve certain political and security goals. And so the idea, as with the kind of, oh, it would be commercially problematic if they did X and Y. It's been very economically problematic for China to take a lot of the decisions that they've been taking in the last period of time, and they've decided to do it anyway because
Mm.
the priorities have shifted, and that is something that bears the imprint of Xi Jinping. I think there would have been other leaders who would have balanced this out differently. And I mean, I cite in the book this point after the financial crisis when I went to meet this Chinese academic who kind of,
Mm.
basically said, the cooperation times are done. I am done. The only debate now is should we be more assertive now or more assertive later? The strategic direction is now clear. Um, and there are some who think Xi Jinping moved too fast. There are a couple of major vulnerabilities that China still has, particularly in the technology sector and in global finance,
Mm.
the
In
dollar
terms of,
system.
sorry, yeah, I was about to say, just
Yeah,
like, is that, do you mean sort of microchips, and then financially, I'm assuming we're just talking strength of the Chinese yen versus the dollar.
yeah, I mean, you have the two dimensions of vulnerability are essentially that China is still dependent on US intellectual property, and not just US. I mean, kind of to some extent Western, across a whole series of different areas. It's still a US. I mean, semiconductors has been one focal point, and on advanced semiconductors. But it's software, it's design tools, it's a whole kind of list of things, and it cuts across a range of different areas. And there are still just areas where China, although they've thrown prodigious sums of money into trying to build up the indigenous capabilities in these areas, they still lag behind. And if you look at the way they're enforcing the Russia sanctions, there are still a lot of Chinese companies who are totally paranoid about being cut off from access to the Western technological and the US ecosystem. If they get slapped with
Is,
the same
is
export controls.
is that a realistic possibility though? Like, do you because like part like I always have this like hypothetical discussion with people about it. It's like, look, if say we just decided for there's numerous reasons you could decide this. Like even before the war in Ukraine, you could say, okay, the West, as the West or as the developed world, we are not cool with what seems to be going on in Xinjiang, and we think that's abhorrent and wrong, and therefore we're going to cut ties with you economically. Like we're just going to stop. Like we're just going to stop for 6 months. We're not going to buy anything from you. It's like is that like in any industry like a realistic possibility? Because it seemed like COVID showed us that so many of our supply chains are so intertwined with China that we wouldn't actually physically be capable of making that decision.
Well, I mean, I think that's the big. I mean, there's two sides to this question now. What one is the sort of one is the issue of how we identify and quantify and mitigate some of these specific dependencies where we are genuinely reliant on China in certain critical areas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this has obviously been the case with rare earths and a couple of, but I mean, there are some countries that are still reliant on them for pharmaceutical inputs. Or I mean, we have had a version of globalization that's been very Sino-centric. There are lots of things that run through China at the moment, and the pandemic certainly illustrated that. But some of these are contingent. I mean, there are some that has been true, but it is also possible some of these things do not rely on kind of specific resources that China has or specific things that can't be replicated elsewhere. It would just take time and it would be costly to be able to kind of rebalance some of these things. And I think there's a big exercise in figuring out what that would amount to and how to still still trade, but be sufficiently resilient if you did have a kind of Russia-style hard cutoff that you could live with it in a certain sense.
Yeah.
But the other piece of this is
we say hard cutoff. We've shown what a hard cutoff looks like with Russia. It's like, no, we're not going to use their. No, actually, we kind of need it. No, we're not going to take their grain. Oh no, maybe we kind of need some of that. Do you know what I mean? Like even in the face of this, we haven't managed to hold up to our word.
Well, true, and I mean, I think this is the issue in some of these scenarios with China as well. That I mean, China still needs to trade with us in all serious areas. We still need to trade with China, and the question is what's the map of these dependencies actually look like? Where can we really live without China, and where not? Where are these asymmetrical? Where can they be weaponized one way or the other? I think what we've seen on the technology side is there are some real choke points where if the US cuts off certain specific access to specific technologies, then it will have a kind of highly targeted impact on the Chinese side that will have profound effects on that specific sector, but it's not going to derail the whole of the economic relationship. And they can do that in a very targeted way. And it's quite hard for the Chinese side to retaliate effectively. We'll run through a real test of that with semiconductors in the coming months and to some extent years. But you also have this question, which is if we go into a scenario which is quite plausible in the years ahead with Taiwan, which could conceivably see would ultimately see a war between the United States and China, we're going to deal with a profound economic shock as a result of that. However involved people choose to be in sanctions or otherwise, and so I mean, on the Chinese side, these vulnerabilities when it comes to financial sanctions are still a huge concern in that situation, because if we're in that sort of environment, which would be substantially greater in terms of direct military clashes versus what we're doing at the moment, which is where this kind of proxy conflict in a certain sense. We'd be in a situation in which you would expect that a number of these financial sanctions would be applied to China, and that's the measures that have been applied to Russia. I think very much the intention has been to conceive of these tools and think about them with future application to contingencies that might involve Taiwan as well, and to be able to threaten that in a certain way to China, to be able to say, look, we've gone further up the escalation ladder on the kind of economic warfare side than you had expected, on central bank measures, on SWIFT, on these things that you thought we wouldn't do. We will do these things, and you can't trust that we won't do them to you too. And so this is still this big point of vulnerability, because if it would be extremely costly to us, but so would the war. And it will be a scenario that would see China in some of these scenarios, or critical firms or whatever, cut out of the international financial architecture and be treated like Iran or Russia or North Korea or something. And the ripple effects for China would be far greater in some respects than for Russia. I mean, it's a far more intertwined economy than Russia's, even though the blowback would be far greater for the United States, for Europe in that situation as well. But that's still the area in which China knows it's vulnerable and knows that it needs to build up certain forms of resilience that right now it does not have on the financial side.
So would you say then, in a sense, that the sanctions we're imposing on Russia at the moment are sort of a, just watch out, we could do this to you sort of like thing? Just like, obviously there's like the main reason for doing it, but like just in the background, do you think that's what like some of the Western powers are thinking?
Especially on the US side, certainly. I think this, everyone who is at the top levels crafting policy on this, on the US side, has China in mind on any of these questions as well. It's kind of, this has been a crisis where, rather than being purely kind of pulled away from the China thinking, as had happened in the past, the China thinking on this has been completely ingrained in some of the tactics and approaches and longer term strategy involved in this. So certainly when it comes to the financial sanctions, the export controls, there's been a kind of mindedness and planning and thinking about what this would mean for China too. And in fact, some of the measures, I mean, some of them were in motion already, but we've seen on the Chinese, on the chip sector, some of the measures, they're not. Some of these are similar tools that have been used on the US side as the tools that have been used against Russia. And those tools were pioneered against Huawei. And so, I mean, when you're going through and kind of looking at the traceability of kind of, everything becomes easier when you've done it once in a specific application. We've seen this with sanctions across the board. You'd never have had the Iran sanctions without the North Korea sanctions. You'd never have had the Russia sanctions without the Iran sanctions. And China becomes more imaginable after what we've seen with Russia than it was before. We'd seen what we've seen with Russia, and we've kind of tested out the muscle memory and the kind of how will this work and what will the points of tension be. And again, it would be a radically different and more difficult task, and with very different consequences. But China now has to entertain the possibility that we would operate at a higher level than I think they had thought was likely at the beginning of this year.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.